Today with us, very happy to have Monica and Stephanie from the Global Infrastructure Hub. This hub was created in 2014 by the G20 to provide dedicated resources to help implement the agenda on sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure through action-oriented programs. They're located in Sydney, as they are now, but they also have offices in Toronto, as in 2018, Canada has contributed 20 million Canadian dollars to the Global Infrastructure Hub to establish themselves in Toronto. So we got to know about you guys and your great work. As you know, as I was contacted by Mary Lam Frendo, who's the CEO of the Hub, and she's an ex-colleague of mine of the World Economic Forum. And she contacted me to kind of talk about the great work they were doing on the futures. And I also participated in the launch of the work together with the World Economic Forum beginning of July. So looking at the work, you guys are doing and looking at the future, we thought it would be relevant that you come and talk to us in this platform. Because infrastructure, as you know, obviously from the funding that you have received also, is that infrastructure matters to Canada. For example, through the Investing in Canada plan and the Building a Better Canada, there's more than 180 billion being invested over 12 years to provide predictable and sustainable funding for projects that will build these modern, resilient and green communities for Canadians. About a quarter of all non-residential investments in Canada is investments in infrastructure, and nearly 600,000 jobs were associated with the production of infrastructure assets in 2018. So significant sector and activity for Canada. So Monica is the Director of Thought Leadership within the organization. And so she's leading the development, the delivery and the dissemination of the strategic and innovation focused programs, including work streams around innovative funding and financing, Infratech, the infrastructure futures that we will be discussing, and transformative futures post-COVID. Stephanie Barker is now Strategy and Operations Associate, but up until recently, she was an analyst at the Hub, and she was leading the work that will be presented now. So welcome very much for being with us today. We really look forward to the presentation and to the conversation. I hope it will provide a lot of value and good conversations with staff from the Government of Canada. And I will leave here the floor to you for the presentation, after which we will have a session of Q&A. So Monica, Stephanie, up to you.
Excellent. Look, thank you so much, Crystal, for that introduction, and thank you as well to Rachel and Claire for the invitation to present today. And indeed, I think a lot of the work that we're doing around futures is very much aligned with what you're doing at Policy Horizons, but I think more broadly as well around some of the interests of Canada more broadly around infrastructure. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Steph, just the next. So the work that we're going to be presenting today is a summary of the Infrastructure Futures work that we developed in collaboration with the World Economic Forum and the Boston Consulting Group. And really what we can expect from the presentation today is, for us to share some of the global market sentiment around scenarios, the survey that we undertook of 400 practitioners from around the world, and some of the scenarios and the implications of some of those megatrends, and also sharing some real world examples on how some of those potential trends might actually be applied in real life. We hope to be able to stimulate some discussion around how some of these trends and ideas might actually apply to your context. So, I'm really keen to hear about some of the questions that you might have for us as well afterwards. And I think the slides are a little bit slow in showing through, so just bear with us for a minute. So our agenda today is to talk, very briefly about the introduction to the project, and then I'm going to hand over to Steph to talk about our survey and the market sentiment on the megatrends. And then she'll hand back to me to talk about the scenarios and some of the implications around infrastructure. And then I'll give a few examples of how some strategies and policies may have been implemented in real life, and then we'll move to Q&A. So you may be wondering why we went down the route of infrastructure futures. And I guess the Hub's vision is really for a future where sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure works for all people. So we're really advocating for quality infrastructure because it does have the potential to have a long-term effect on the economy and on human flourishing in general. For us to be able to achieve a world where quality infrastructure is the norm, transformation is needed in the industry. And I guess what we mean by transformation is the way that in which infrastructure is delivered. So it's the ability for governments and the private sector to be able to create new benchmarks, best practice that are then replicated globally. But also for some of that transformative infrastructure to achieve some aspirational policy objectives when it comes to sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. So collaboration is absolutely critical for us in achieving that particular objective. And we're working in a number of themes of work across the Hub where collaboration is essential, and we are looking to collaborate with people across the industry with knowledge and best practice and research in this area to help us drive that particular objective. And many of you may not know about the Global Infrastructure Hub, so Crystal gave us a really good overview. And we're a G20 funded organization where our objective is really to help the G20 drive that sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure program. We do that in 3 ways. So the first one is we're trying to encourage and mobilize more private capital into infrastructure projects. We're also helping the industry do more with less across the project life cycle. And we would like to demonstrate that quality infrastructure can have a transformative economic recovery post-COVID. And we have 5 themes of work, which I've listed there. And that ranges from everything from investment all the way through to infratech. But really, our work is focused on being able to create the evidence that can justify action and change. We help facilitate that change by through networking and collaboration with our G20 stakeholders and the broader industry. And a lot of the work that we do around thought leadership is also about keeping in touch with market needs and the market trends so that then we can be responsive to those market trends and create the relevant insights that are actually relevant to the market. So next slide, please, Steph. I believe I might be handing over to you. I'll hand it over to you now to talk about the methodology.
Thanks, Monica. So as Monica mentioned, we do hope that this report is only the beginning of the conversation on the future of infrastructure and how we can all work together in a collaborative effort to create a better, more resilient and more sustainable and inclusive world. So we followed a 3-step methodology to construct our scenarios. The first step in which was to identify and prioritize megatrends. And we ultimately identified a list of 25 megatrends which we believed would have the greatest impact on infrastructure development over the course of the next 30 years. We then conducted a survey of over 400 infrastructure experts from around the world to further prioritize and analyze global sentiment on those megatrends. And I'll go into more detail on those trends in just a moment. This survey helped us to rank the megatrends according to 3 dimensions, which were certainty, impact, and preparedness. As part of this process, we also conducted a workshopping session with the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Infrastructure. Following this session, we constructed our 3 possible scenarios describing the future these trends might create. These scenarios are relatively extreme extrapolations of current trends, yet they still remain plausible. And these will be presented later, as Monica mentioned, along with the implications or the potential implications of these scenarios. So we're now in step 3 of our methodology to create impact through action. And we hope to, through these sorts of conversations, to be able to prioritize research and areas for further work and investigation. We also hope to test the ongoing resilience and evolution of our scenarios and their implications in a post-COVID world. We encourage members of the infrastructure community and indeed the broader community to investigate the potential impacts and implications of these scenarios and to take action to ensure that strategies and plans are resilient to the full spectrum of possible developments. So I'll go back to step 1 in our methodology, which was to identify and prioritise the megatrends, which you can see to the right there. So to ultimately end up with this list of 25 megatrends, we first contacted BCG's Centre for Sensing and Mining the Future. I should mention that BCG were one of our partners on this project, along with the World Economic Forum. So we got in touch with BCG Centre for Sensing and Mining the Future, which they monitor a database of over 100 potentially relevant megatrends. We triangulated these trends with others from thought leaders such as the World Economic Forum, who produce a number of relevant thought leadership pieces. Perhaps the most relevant to this work is their annual Global Risk Report and also the World Future Society. Next, we conducted interviews and held internal brainstorming and prioritisation sessions to ultimately end up with this list of 25 megatrends. And we finally sought feedback and validation on this list through the workshop with the World Economic Forum's GFC. These 25 megatrends can all be categorised into one of the following 5 themes you can see on the screen there. The first being society and workforce, which largely comprises of trends to do with demographic shifts and sort of changes in societal preferences. Then it's market and customers, and these are largely related to trade, supply and demand, procurement and financing. We then have geopolitics and regulation, which are pretty self-explanatory, but are largely related to international spheres of influence and politics. Technology is the next group of trends, and finally we have sustainability and resilience, which are more or less related to sort of climate change and related developments. So the next step in the process was we conducted a survey whereby we had over 400 respondents with a really diverse mix between mature and emerging markets and representation from all G20 countries. The majority of respondents came from the countries depicted on the slide there, but we did have responses from about 70 countries in total. And Canadian respondents accounted for 12% of the total mature market responses, which you can see was 65% of total responses. Respondents came from the full spectrum of different organisational types and represented all organisational levels, including quite a large number of CEOs and directors. We had 27 Canadian respondents across all organisation types, with the exception of international organisations. And there were 82 government respondents across all countries. So this diversity in respondents gave us quite broad access to a solid cross-section of the global infrastructure community and allowed us to glean a wealth of insights from their responses. So for each of the 25 megatrends, the survey asked members of the infrastructure community for their views on 3 dimensions. The first was the certainty of both the direction and impact of each trend. The second was the potential impact of the trend. And the third dimension was the preparedness of the infrastructure industry to handle the trend. For the purpose of generating scenarios, the most interesting megatrends are those that are high in uncertainty, involving many possible futures, high in potential impact for the infrastructure industry, involving potentially very different futures, and those for which the industry felt least prepared and involve potential future actions and policies that can make a significant difference. So this chart on the screen provides a snapshot of the entire data set in one concise view. It shows that, on average, respondents were mostly certain about the direction of the megatrends. And whilst this is interesting, our focus for this webinar and indeed for future work will be more centred on the other 2 dimensions of impact and preparedness. as these two dimensions, when combined, can identify the trends which pose the biggest potential risk, and therefore where we as an industry should focus our efforts. As can be seen from the chart, our survey respondents on average felt that the infrastructure industry was rather unprepared for the future. And I'll break this down a little further in the coming slides. These two charts show the average scores for impact and preparedness. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be focusing on these two dimensions. And they show the average scores for these two dimensions across the 25 megatrends for both mature market respondents on the left-hand side and emerging market respondents on the right. And each dot on the chart represents one of the 25 megatrends. So we have preparedness on the vertical axis with the average line running across the screen, and impact on the horizontal axis with the average line running up and down the screen. The higher the score, the higher the impact, and the higher the preparedness of the megatrend. So these lines break the plot into 4 quadrants, with the bottom right quadrant presenting the megatrends with the lowest preparedness, but the highest impact. And in essence, these are the ones that pose the highest risk to our industry if we remain unprepared to address or to manage or mitigate them. Overlaying the megatrends that our respondents felt they were least prepared for, you can see they are quite similar across mature and emerging markets. The lowest preparedness score on average was that of climate change in mature markets on the left-hand side there, which had an average score of 1.93 out of 4. So the megatrends here are clustered in the sustainability and resilience and the geopolitics and regulation themes, which were the 2 themes with the lowest preparedness overall. And as you can tell by their position on the chart in that bottom right quadrant, they also overlap significantly with the list of megatrends respondents selected as likely to have greatest impact. This suggests that sustainability and geopolitics are viewed as 2 areas in which further preparation may be required. Now, if we look now at the highest impact trends on the right-hand side of the charts, these are the trends which present different potential futures from today. Emerging and mature market respondents were both of the opinion that urbanisation and population growth would have the greatest impact on infrastructure development. Interestingly, the views of these 2 markets diverge on the trends which will have the next greatest impact. Whilst you can see on the chart on the right, for emerging market respondents, they were preoccupied with technology trends like the rise of green energy sources and Internet of Things, sensors and smart infrastructure. Mature market respondents have focused more on trends like aging infrastructure, with the rise of natural disasters and resilient infrastructure also featuring quite highly in terms of impact. We believe this difference likely reflects the degree of existing infrastructure in each market, with the relatively greenfield nature of emerging markets leading to more of an emphasis on new technologies and financing, with a couple of the financing trends also featuring highly in terms of impact, whilst mature markets with extensive, albeit aging infrastructure, were more focused on green issues and how to recycle, retrofit and make existing infrastructure more resilient. And while the rise of green energy sources and IoT sensors and smart infrastructure were the only technology trends, those in yellow on the right-hand side, that ranked in the top 5 megatrends in terms of impact to industry. Technology megatrends overall were all ranked above average in terms of impact, leading to that theme having the highest overall impact rating out of the 5 themes. The trend with the highest perceived risk, which is shown in these charts by having low preparedness and high impact, was the rise of climate change. This was also validated through a question we asked in the survey on the megatrend which would pose the greatest risk to infrastructure development, and climate change was also selected as the greatest risk. So which megatrends did Canadian respondents think posed the greatest risk? So Canada's responses were largely aligned with the results shown on the previous slides. We have overlaid Canada's responses in yellow on top of the mature market responses from the previous slide. Respondents from Canada also selected urbanisation and population growth as the megatrend which would have the greatest impact on infrastructure development, which is aligned with mature market responses overall, which you can see just here. Next, in terms of impact, were rise of natural disasters and resilient infrastructure, aging infrastructure, and the rise of climate change. And again, these were aligned with mature market responses. You can see these two dots here, which are slightly overlapping, the rise of climate change and the rise of natural disasters dots for mature market responses. And this dot under here is the aging infrastructure dot for mature market responses. So I'm now going to pass the mic back over to Monica, who is going to talk to you about how we used these survey results to eventually create our 3 scenarios. Monica, you're on mute.
I knew that was going to happen. Sorry about that. What we did was we constructed scenarios using megatrends that we saw as having the highest potential to shape very different futures. So we chose 3, what we call determinants. So the first one is geopolitical context, the second one is the pace of climate change, and the third one is technological progress. And we actually mapped around 8 different scenarios across, contrasting across, a range of different combinations, I guess, of those extreme determinants. So of the 8, we reviewed them to identify the 3 that provided, the most extreme views, because some of those scenarios, when we really broke it down and decided to develop a narrative around it, were quite similar. So we actually chose 3 that we felt had sufficiently contrasting views to provide a bit of color to what some of the potential scenarios for the future of infrastructure might look like. So those 3 scenarios are the conflicted planet, the digital planet, and the green planet, which I will talk to you about in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. So next slide, please, Steph. So in each of our scenarios, we developed a narrative of what the world could potentially look like in terms of infrastructure. And so these scenarios are extreme, but yet they're plausible. And there would certainly be more than one interpretation of this kind of scenario. But what we'll do is we'll start with, with the various scenarios and implications that we had in our report. And I won't go through this in too much detail, as you could probably read the full narrative in our report if you really wanted to. But what I'll do is I'll outline the key features in each scenario. So in this scenario of the conflicted planets, you can see some of the extreme features there in terms of geopolitical context, the pace of climate change, and technological progress, all on the left-hand side of that chart there. And in the conflicted planet as shown here, the main feature is really the increased political competition globally, which drives much of the follow-on implications. And this increased political competition basically has the effect of less sharing of knowledge and best practice globally, which affects 2 main things really. And the first one is the world's ability to be able to fight climate change. So a lack of global cooperation, can lead to domestic climate policies that are essentially variable around the world rather than coordinated. And this ultimately leads to regional climate inequality, where some countries are more severely impacted by climate change than others. And what happens is the world also loses the ability to leverage some of the synergistic effects of coordination around climate action. The second main thing is that increased global competition also hinders technology development and innovation. So this not only has a detrimental effect on a country's ability to fight climate change because there's a lack of technology, but it also leads to less productivity and economic growth. So, all in all, this is a rather grim global outlook. This is the scenario that we're heading towards. Next slide, please, Steph. Our next scenario is a digital planet, which is the complete opposite of the conflicted planet. So as you can see by the three dimensions shown on the right there. So in this scenario, there's actually a high global cooperation, which leads to the development of disruptive technology and its rapid uptake. So this rapid development of technology essentially transforms the global response to climate change, as technology now enables rapid mitigation and adaptation measures. On the infrastructure front, there's also a large emphasis on infratech, which enables data to be treated as infrastructure. So, rather interestingly, what this means is that data now has a value associated with it, very much like a physical asset. And its value is essentially derived by how effectively it can help you make better decisions around optimizing that particular physical asset. So another really interesting feature of the digital planet is the rise of big tech firms as the primary agency for the delivery of infrastructure services. And because technology is evolving so rapidly, large tech firms basically become the first to respond to market needs rather than government. And you could probably see some of the examples emerging at the moment, like autonomous vehicles, for example, or ride-sharing schemes, or the use of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones for passenger travel, which is still in the conceptual stages, but that could become reality. Next slide, please. And our final scenario is the green planet. And in this scenario, everything comes second to safeguarding the environment. And this is really what drives the global collective action around climate change. Technology development here is incremental, and all technology is now focused on achieving green outcomes rather than that of productivity and growth. So, it's not all, nice and fuzzy green sustainability and resilience. There is a big emphasis on the circular economy, and therefore there's a decline in the development of green infrastructure projects. And also the centralized utility model ends up being disrupted by the emergence of prosumers. Next slide. So the scenarios and their implications give us a good feel for some of the areas that the industry needs to start thinking about and responding to. And our scenarios are really designed to be able to stimulate some discussion across the industry to help test the robustness of some of the policies and strategies that are emerging. And that's especially important post-COVID. And if you move on to the next slide, Steph. Since Steph and I have just spent the last 20 minutes talking about hypothetical scenarios and megatrends, I wanted to finish this presentation by giving 3 examples of where policy and strategy, have been developed and perhaps implemented to drive the ideal future. So the 3 organizations presented here, presented at one of our other webinars on infrastructure futures. And I should also point out that your very own Christel van der Elst was also a panelist on the webinar. And, she didn't represent Policy Horizons at the time, but, she provided us her perspectives on alternative futures for infrastructure. And I was going to include some of her comments in here as well, but I thought it might be a little bit unusual if I were to relay her views while she's actually sitting on the call. So I think, Christel, feel free to share your views later on if you would like. So the first example here is that of the EBRD, or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So they have adopted a very strong culture and strategy for investing in sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure with their clients. And part of the strategy includes their transition impact qualities framework. And I encourage you to look it up. It's actually really interesting, which basically aims to make the countries in which they work competitive, inclusive, well-governed, green, resilient, and integrated. And one of the criteria that the bank implements is that they choose qualities from this framework to focus on for each project they invest in. The next example is that from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, who are responding to a drastic shift in the market that remarkably has not yet been filled. And that is really the issue of the future of workforce as a result of rapid digital transformation. So RICS recently developed a paper on industrialized construction and the future roles and new skill sets that might be needed to make this happen. And they're currently working with government and academia to bridge this gap in digital skill sets, more specifically for the construction industry. The next example is the Infrastructure Client Group in the UK, which piloted the Project 13 infrastructure delivery strategy, which you may be familiar with. So, Project 13 is a set of best practice principles for infrastructure delivery in general, but a key element of this is also around data and digital transformation. So they're working with a lot of private sector organizations as well as government to be able to create a standardized set of rules around data. And their vision for a digital future is one where the industry moves from a transactional model to an enterprise model of procurement, which enables a much freer flow of data from owner through to the ecosystem and vice versa, which is a really critical, essential component of having a successful digital future. Next slide, please, Steph. And so finally, another example is some of the work that the Global Infrastructure Hub has done in collaboration with the World Bank and the Saudi G20 presidency, and this is on infratech. So the infratech agenda, which was recently endorsed by the G20, is a policy guidance to advise the adoption of technologies and infrastructure. And the role that we had under that was to develop an infratech use case library, and the aim of which was really to help raise awareness of what's out there and what works, with the goal of being able to help the industry overcome some of the barriers to technology adoption. So the goal of the infratech agenda more generally is to stress the importance of technological solutions in achieving sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I think we're going to Q&A, but we are going to pause for 3 seconds.